The music inside the club was loud. Glasses clinked. The men laughed. Millions of dollars had just been made that night. At the center table, some of the most powerful men in the city were there celebrating like kings. Then suddenly, a hand grabbed a waitress by the waist. The girl gasped as one of the Mafia bosses pulled her closer. "Relax," he laughed. "You should feel honored serving men like us." Two other waitresses nearby froze, their trays shaking slightly. No one in the room moved. No one dared to interrupt. Except for one person. Another waitress stepped forward. Calmly, she took the boss's wrist and removed his hand from the frightened girl. The music was still playing, but something in the room shifted. A few men at the table slowly stopped laughing. The boss stared at her, surprised then amused. "Careful," he said, leaning closer. "You sound very brave for someone wearing an apron." Another man slammed his glass on the table. "Who do you think you are to challenge us?" For a moment, the waitress said nothing. She simply placed the drink tray on the table. Then she slowly looked around the room, studying every face. And suddenly, one of the older bosses stopped smiling. Because at that moment, he realized something was very wrong. But by the time anyone else in the room understood it, it was already too late. 20 years ago, a loyal man lost everything because of a lie. His name was erased. His family was abandoned. And the men responsible believed the truth would stay buried forever. But time has a strange way of bringing forgotten things back. Tonight, inside this very club, powerful men are celebrating a new deal worth millions. They believe they control the city. They believe nothing can touch them. What they don't know is that this celebration is about to become something else entirely. A reckoning that has been waiting for 20 years. And before this night ends, the truth about a forgotten name will return to this room. But first, let's go back to where the story really began. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, justice, and power, make sure you stay until the end because what happens tonight will change everything. 20 years earlier, long before the celebration in the club, the name Mateo Rivera meant something very different in the city. Mateo was not a boss. He did not sit at expensive tables or drink rare whiskey with powerful men. He was a soldier, the kind of man sent to handle the dangerous jobs others did not want. But in the neighborhoods where he worked, people spoke about him with quiet respect. One evening, Mateo stopped outside a small pharmacy on a narrow street. A worried father stood at the counter, arguing softly with the pharmacist. "I will pay next week," the man pleaded. "My daughter needs the medicine." The pharmacist shook his head. "I can't give it away." Mateo listened for a moment. Then he stepped forward and placed money on the counter. "Give him the medicine," he said calmly. The father looked at him in shock. "You don't even know me." Mateo simply shrugged. "Your daughter needs help, that is enough." Moments like that spread through the neighborhood. Shop owners remembered how Mateo stopped violent collectors from destroying their stores. Families remembered how he quietly paid bills when someone got sick. Even people who feared the Mafia trusted one man, Mateo Rivera. But respect in the streets does not always bring respect inside the Mafia. Sometimes it creates something far more dangerous: jealousy. And one night, while Mateo was eating dinner with his wife Alina and their young daughter Isabella, a black car stopped outside their home. A message arrived from the bosses. They wanted to see him immediately. Mateo stared at the message for a long moment. Then he slowly stood up. Because deep down, something about this meeting didn't feel right. Mateo Rivera arrived at the meeting place just before midnight. It was an old warehouse near the docks, a place the organization often used for private discussions. Two guards stood outside the door. They nodded when they saw him. Inside, several Mafia bosses were already waiting. The air felt heavy. No music. No drinks. No friendly greetings. Mateo noticed something strange immediately. Too many people were in the room. Usually, only 1 or 2 bosses attended these meetings. Tonight there were 5. At the center table sat Domenico Baron, the most powerful man in the organization. Beside him was Leonid Petrov, the quiet strategist who handled the group's money. Mateo remained calm. "You called for me," he said. Baron leaned back in his chair. "Yes," he replied slowly, "we did." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Petrov opened a small folder on the table. "We have a problem," he said. He slid several papers across the table. Mateo looked down at them. Financial records. Numbers circled in red ink. "Money is missing from our accounts," Petrov continued. Mateo frowned. "I don't handle the money." Petrov nodded slowly. "That is true." Then he added something that made the room colder. "But the missing shipments were under your protection." A quiet murmur moved around the table. Baron leaned forward slightly. "Tell us something, Mateo," he said. Why would a loyal soldier suddenly steal from his own organization? Mateo's eyes hardened. Because he wouldn't. The room fell silent. Then Petrov closed the folder and said something far worse. "There is another accusation." The room grew colder after Petrov spoke. Mateo did not move. He simply watched the men sitting around the table. Petrov folded his hands calmly. "The missing money is not the only problem," he said. Baron leaned back in his chair and studied Mateo's face. Petrov continued. "For several months, our rivals have known things they should not know." One of the bosses tapped his finger on the table. "Routes, deliveries, safe houses." Petrov nodded slowly. Information only a trusted soldier could access. Mateo understood what they were saying. And he understood something else. The decision had already been made. "You think I'm a spy," he said quietly. Baron did not answer immediately. He simply looked at the others. Then he shrugged. "What we think doesn't matter anymore." The room fell silent. Mateo took a slow breath. 20 years I've worked for this organization," he said. "I handled the jobs no one else wanted." No one responded. Mateo's voice stayed calm. "Look at me and tell me you believe this." But the men avoided his eyes. Because believing the lie was easier. Finally, Mateo asked the only question that mattered. "What will happen to my family?" Baron gave a small, careless shrug. "They will manage." A guard stepped forward. Mateo understood what was coming. Before they could move, he spoke again. "If you're going to kill me," he said quietly, "then at least remember something." Baron looked annoyed. "What?" Mateo lifted his head. "I never betrayed you." Outside the building, a small girl was running toward the club doors. She was crying and calling her father's name. The doors of the club were taller than Isabella remembered. Bright lights shone from inside. Music drifted through the air. But the little girl standing outside wasn't looking at the lights or listening to the music. She was crying. "Please," she told the guard at the door, "I need to see them." The guard frowned. "This isn't a place for children." "My father is inside," Isabella insisted. "They took him here." The guard shook his head. "Go home." But Isabella didn't leave. She slipped past him and rushed through the open doorway. Inside, the room was full of laughter. Powerful men sat around a large table covered with bottles and glasses. They were celebrating. One of them had just finished telling a joke when the little girl ran forward. She stopped in front of the table, breathing hard. "My father is Mateo Rivera," she said. The laughter faded slightly. A few men looked confused. Others simply looked annoyed. "Please," Isabella said again. "Someone told me you brought him here." One of the bosses leaned back in his chair. "So," he said. "He didn't come home," she whispered. Another man waved his hand dismissively. "Take the kid outside." Isabella stepped closer instead. "My father is not a bad man," she said. The men at the table exchanged glances. Then one of them chuckled. "Rivera," he said. "Yes," Isabella replied quickly. The man picked up a few bills from the table. He tossed them onto the floor in front of her. "Then take this," he said lazily, "and go home." The next morning, the apartment felt strangely quiet. Isabella sat at the small kitchen table while her mother, Elena Rivera, stared at the front door. Neither of them had slept. Mateo had not come home. By noon, the truth began to spread through the neighborhood. People whispered in low voices. Some avoided looking at the Rivera apartment entirely. Others crossed the street when they saw Elena outside. No one wanted trouble. Late in the afternoon, 3 men from the organization arrived. They didn't knock. They simply opened the door and walked inside. Elena stood up quickly. "Where is my husband?" she demanded. One of the men ignored the question. He looked around the small apartment like he was inspecting it. Then he spoke calmly. "This property now belongs to the organization." Elena blinked in confusion. "What?" "The accounts connected to Mateo Rivera have been closed," the man continued. "Everything he owned is no longer his." Elena's voice shook. "You can't do that." The man finally looked at her. "He betrayed the organization." "That's a lie," Elena shouted. The man's expression did not change. "Argue if you want," he said, "but you have until tomorrow to leave." Isabella stood frozen beside the table. She looked at her mother. Elena looked like someone who had just lost the ground beneath her feet. By the next day, their furniture was gone. Their door was locked. And the name Rivera had quietly become something people were afraid to say. But the hardest years for Isabella and her mother were only beginning. And soon, even worse news would arrive. Years passed, and life did not become easier. Elena Rivera worked wherever she could. Cleaning houses, washing dishes in small restaurants, taking any job that paid even a little money. Every night she returned home exhausted. But she never complained in front of Isabella. She always smiled and said the same thing. "We will be okay." But one winter afternoon, everything changed. Elena was cleaning the floor of a large house when she suddenly felt dizzy. The mop slipped from her hands. The room spun. Then she collapsed. Hours later, Isabella sat beside her mother in a small hospital room. Machines hummed quietly. A doctor stood near the bed, holding a chart. "She needs treatment soon," he said gently. Isabella nodded quickly. "Then treat her." The doctor hesitated. "The medicine is expensive." "How expensive?" Isabella asked. The number he said made her stomach tighten. It was more money than they had ever seen. "But will it help her?" Isabella whispered. The doctor nodded. "If she receives it soon." That night, Isabella ran across the city. She knocked on the doors of people who once worked with her father. Men who used to respect Mateo Rivera. Some did not open their doors. Others listened quietly, then shook their heads. Helping the family of a man called a traitor was too dangerous. By morning, Isabella returned to the hospital with empty hands. Her mother was awake. Elena smiled weakly when she saw her. Then she said something that made Isabella's heart begin to race. "Come closer," Elena whispered. "There's something you must know about your father." Isabella moved closer to the bed. Her mother's hand felt weak in hers. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft sound of the machines. "Elena," Isabella said quickly, "don't worry, I will find the money, I promise." Her mother shook her head slowly. "No, my child," she whispered. "Listen to me." Tears filled Isabella's eyes. "You're going to be fine." But Alina's tired smile said something different. For a moment she closed her eyes, gathering the little strength she had left. Then she looked at Isabella again. "Your father was not a traitor." "I know," Isabella said immediately. But Alina squeezed her hand. "No," she said softly, "you must understand this." Her voice grew weaker. "Many people believed the lie because they were afraid. Your father was a loyal man." Isabella nodded through her tears. Alina's breathing became slower. "You must promise me something." "Anything," Isabella said quickly. "Promise me you will never believe their lies about him." "I promise." "And promise me something else." Isabella leaned closer. Alina whispered the last words she would ever say. "One day, the truth must come back." Her hand slowly relaxed in Isabella. The machines beside the bed made a long, empty sound. Isabella sat there without moving. The world felt suddenly silent. She had lost her father years ago. Now her mother is gone too. But as Isabella left the hospital that night, she noticed a man standing across the street watching her. And he had been there for a very long time. The night air felt cold as Isabella stepped out of the hospital. She walked slowly down the quiet street. Her mind felt empty. She had nowhere to go. No family left. No one was waiting for her. Halfway down the block, a voice spoke behind her. "Isabella." She stopped. The man who had been standing across the street was now closer. He was older, with gray in his hair and a long scar across his cheek. His eyes were calm but serious. "You don't know me," he said. Isabella said nothing. But she did not run. The man nodded slightly. "That makes sense." He paused before continuing. "My name is Victor Salazar." The name meant nothing to Isabella. Victor studied her face for a moment. "Your father once saved my life," he said. Isabella's eyes lifted. "What?" Victor pointed toward a nearby bench. "Sit for a moment." She hesitated, then slowly sat down. Victor remained standing. "Years ago, during a job near the docks, I was surrounded," he explained. "I should have died that night. But your father came back for me." Isabella listened quietly. "He didn't have to," Victor continued. "He could have escaped, and no one would blame him. But Mateo Rivera believed loyalty mattered." Victor's voice grew softer. "I owed him a debt I could never repay." Isabella looked down at the ground. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said. Victor shook his head. "It matters now more than ever." She looked up again. Victor's eyes were serious. "Because if you want the truth about what happened to your father..." He paused. "Then you cannot stay weak." Isabella felt something shift inside her. Victor continued quietly. "If you want justice..." He leaned slightly closer. "You must become stronger than the men who killed him." Isabella did not answer Victor that night. But the next morning, she returned to the bench. Victor was already there. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once, like he had expected her. "Good," he said, "then we begin." The first lessons were not what Isabella expected. Victor did not hand her a weapon. He handed her a notebook. "Write down everything you remember," he said. "Names, places, faces." For hours, Isabella wrote. The men from the club. The guards. The neighborhood streets. Victor studied the pages carefully. "Power starts with information," he said. Weeks turned into months. Victor trained her every day. He taught her how the Mafia really worked. Who controlled money. Who controlled fear. And who secretly controlled both. He also trained her body. Running through empty streets before sunrise. Learning how to defend herself if someone attacked. But Victor repeated one lesson more than any other. "Anger makes people reckless," he said. "Patience builds empires." Years slowly passed. Isabella grew stronger, smarter, more disciplined. But one night, Victor finally told her something new. "There are people in this city who respect your father," he said. "Real people, not the men who betrayed him." Isabella looked at him. "Where are they?" Victor gave a small smile. "They're waiting to see what kind of person you will become." He stood up and placed a hand on the table. "Because tonight," Victor's eyes became serious, "you are going to meet the first one." That night, Victor brought Isabella to a small restaurant on the edge of the city. It was quiet, the kind of place most powerful people never noticed. An old man sat at a corner table drinking tea. Victor walked toward him. The man looked up slowly. His eyes stopped on Isabella. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood. "You have his eyes," the old man said softly. Isabella felt her chest tighten. "You knew my father." The man nodded. "My name is Daniel Cruz." Victor pulled out a chair for Isabella. "Daniel owns 3 shipping warehouses," Victor explained. "And 20 years ago, Mateo saved his family." Daniel looked down at the table. "My daughter needed surgery," he said quietly. "I had no money." He glanced at Isabella. "Your father paid the hospital bill without telling anyone." Isabella swallowed hard. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "When Victor told me who you were, I didn't believe him." He studied her face carefully. "But now I do." Isabella sat quietly. She wasn't sure what to say. Daniel reached into his coat and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside were documents, shipping routes, warehouse records. Victor spoke calmly. "These routes move millions of dollars in goods every month." Daniel nodded. "And tonight," he said slowly, "they belong to you." Isabella stared at the papers. "Why would you trust me?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Because I trusted your father." The room fell silent. Then Victor spoke again. "This is only the beginning." Isabella looked up. "Beginning of what?" Victor's expression was serious. "Of building something powerful enough." He paused. "To face the men who destroyed your family." The years that followed were quiet on the surface. But beneath the calm streets of the city, something new was growing. Daniel Cruz's shipping routes became the first piece of Isabella's network. Victor introduced her to others who had once known Mateo Rivera, a mechanic who owned several garages, a small bank manager who hated the corruption of the old bosses, a former driver who knew every hidden road in the city. At first, they were cautious. But when they saw Isabella's patience and discipline, they began to trust her. Slowly, money started moving. Small businesses opened under different names. Old warehouses were repaired. New routes appeared on the docks. None of it seemed important alone. But together, it created something powerful. An invisible empire. Isabella never rushed. Victor reminded her often. Power built slowly lasts longer. But Isabella never forgot the people her father once helped. Whenever someone in the neighborhood needed medicine or help with rent, quiet assistance arrived. No one knew where the money came from. But people began whispering about a protector working from the shadows. Meanwhile, across the city, the old Mafia bosses believed their empire was stronger than ever. Their clubs were full. Their deals were growing larger. Their celebrations became louder each year. They never noticed the roots slowly slipping from their control, or the soldiers who quietly changed loyalty. One evening, Victor sat across from Isabella with a serious look on his face. "You've been patient for many years," he said. Isabella nodded. Victor folded his hands. "But patience has a limit." Isabella's eyes narrowed slightly. Victor leaned forward. "The men who betrayed your father are preparing something big." He paused. "A celebration." And suddenly, Isabella began to smile. Victor placed a folder on the table. Inside were photographs of a large, elegant building. Isabella recognized it immediately. The same club where the powerful bosses celebrated their victories. The same place where a little girl had once stood crying outside the doors. They're planning a celebration there next month, Victor said. A new deal, bigger than anything they've done before. Isabella studied the pictures quietly. They still think that club belongs to them, Victor continued. But it doesn't. He turned the page in the folder. Legal documents appeared. Ownership transfers. Company records. At first they leased the building through partners, Victor explained. Then those partners sold their shares. To who? Isabella asked. Victor allowed himself a small smile. To a company called Marquez Holdings. Isabella understood immediately. A shell company. Hidden owners. Clean legal paperwork. Victor tapped the final page. And the owner of Marquez Holdings. He looked at her. Is you. But not under the name Rivera. Every document carried a different identity. Isabella Marquez. Isabella closed the folder slowly. So the club is already mine. Victor nodded. And not just the building. He showed her another list. Security staff. Managers. Service workers. Many of them now work for you, he said. Isabella leaned back in her chair. For 20 years she had waited. Planned. Prepared. Now the battlefield belonged to her. Victor watched her carefully. So tell me, he asked quietly. When the night comes, how do you plan to enter that room? Isabella looked toward the window. Then she answered calmly. As someone they will never notice. The night of the celebration arrived with bright lights and loud music. Luxury cars filled the street outside the club. Inside, the room glittered with expensive suits and bottles of rare whiskey. The most powerful men in the city had gathered to celebrate their newest deal. Millions of dollars had just changed hands. Laughter echoed across the marble floors. At the entrance, security checked every guest carefully. But they barely looked at the service staff moving through the door. Waitresses came and went carrying trays of drinks. Among them were 3 women in simple uniforms. One of them was named Lena. Another was Camilla. And the third kept her head slightly lowered as she walked into the room. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her uniform looked exactly like the others. No jewelry. No sign of power. Just another waitress doing her job. The bosses didn't notice her. Why would they? Powerful men rarely look closely at people they believe are beneath them. The music grew louder as the celebration continued. More drinks were ordered. More laughter filled the room. Isabella moved carefully between the tables, listening. Watching. Every face at the center table was one she remembered. Time had added gray hair and deeper wrinkles. But she knew them. Every single one. 20 years of patience had led to this moment. She stopped beside the main table and placed fresh glasses in front of the men. None of them looked up, until one of them suddenly grabbed Lena by the wrist. The tray in Lena's hands trembled. The man laughed loudly. Don't rush away, he said. The other bosses leaned back in their chairs, smiling. And Isabella slowly turned around. Lena tried to pull her wrist away, but the man holding her arm only laughed louder. Relax, he said. We're just having fun. The other bosses around the table grinned. Across the table, another man stepped in front of Camilla, blocking her path. Where are you going so fast? He asked. Camilla froze. The music in the club kept playing, but the waitresses near the table had stopped moving. Everyone knew how these nights usually ended. No one dared interfere. Then Isabella stepped forward. She gently took Lena's arm and removed the man's hand. The boss blinked in surprise. The table grew slightly quieter. Isabella positioned herself between the men and the two frightened waitresses. Her voice was calm. "Leave them alone." For a second, the men stared at her. Then, laughter exploded around the table. One boss leaned back in his chair. "Look at this," he said. "The waitress thinks she's a hero." Marco Bellini stood up slowly. He moved closer until he was only inches away from her. "You should be careful," he said coldly. "Girls who challenge us don't last long in this city." Isabella didn't step back. Instead, she looked directly at the table. "Is this how powerful men behave?" she asked quietly. "Harassing women who cannot fight back." The laughter stopped. Marco's eyes hardened. "How dare you question us?" he said. Then he leaned closer. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Isabella slowly placed the drink tray on the table. Her eyes moved across every face, and the room began to grow strangely quiet. For a moment, no one in the room spoke. The music from the speakers suddenly sounded distant. Marco Bellini still stood in front of her, waiting for an answer. "Well," he demanded, "who are you?" Isabella looked at him calmly. Then her eyes moved slowly around the table. One face after another. Men who had laughed 20 years ago. Men who had tossed money at a crying child. Finally she spoke. "Before tonight ends," she said quietly, "you will remember a name." Marco frowned. "What are you talking about?" But before he could say more, something strange happened. Several security guards around the room suddenly stepped closer to the main table. Not toward Isabella. Toward the bosses. One of the men at the table noticed first. "Why are they standing there?" he asked. Marco turned his head. "Get back to your positions," he barked. The guards didn't move. Across the room, a phone on the table began to ring. Then another. And another. Some of the bosses picked up their phones. Their faces slowly changed. "What?" one of them whispered. Another stood up suddenly. "That can't be right." Marco grabbed one of the phones and read the message. His eyes widened. Their shipping routes were gone. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their warehouses had been seized. Everything was happening at the same time. The room filled with confused voices. Then Isabella finally spoke again. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. "You built your empire on lies." The men slowly turned toward her. And the name she said next made one of them drop his glass. The room fell into complete silence. Isabella looked directly at the table. Then she said the name slowly. "Matteo Rivera." The glass slipped from one boss's hand and shattered on the floor. Across the table, Domenico Barone slowly stood up. His face had lost its color. "That name," he muttered. For the first time that night, fear appeared in his eyes. Isabella's voice remained calm. 20 years ago, you accused a loyal soldier of stealing from you." No one spoke. "You also accused him of being a spy." Leonid Petrov swallowed hard. That accusation was a lie. Isabella continued. "Your own records prove it." She placed a small folder on the table. Inside were copies of the financial reports Petrov had once used. Except now the real numbers were visible. Baron stared at the papers. "How did you get this?" Isabella didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the guards standing around the room. "They work for me now." Marco Bellini stepped backward. "This is impossible." But Isabella continued speaking. "Your roots, your money, your soldiers." She paused. All gone. Outside, the sound of vehicles arriving echoed faintly through the walls. The doors of the club opened. More armed men entered. Men loyal to her. Baron finally understood. This was planned. Isabella nodded once. "For 20 years." Then she looked around the silent room. "My father died because of your lies." Her eyes hardened slightly. And in this world, she paused. Betrayal has a price. One of the bosses suddenly whispered the question everyone was thinking. But who are you? The question hung in the air. But who are you? One of the bosses asked. No one moved. The guards stood silently around the room. The celebration had completely vanished. Only the sound of nervous breathing filled the club. Isabella looked slowly across the table. The same man who had once laughed at a crying child. Then she spoke. My name, she said calmly, is Isabella Rivera. The reaction was immediate. Several men froze. One chair scraped loudly against the floor as someone stood up in shock. Baron stared at her like he had just seen a ghost. Rivera, he whispered. Yes, Isabella replied. The daughter of the man you executed. The room fell silent again. Marco Bellini shook his head. That's impossible. Isabella didn't respond to him. Instead, she placed another small notebook on the table. The cover was old and worn. My father carried this everywhere, she said. Baron frowned. What is it? Isabella opened the notebook. Inside were dozens of names. Families. Shop owners. Children. People the bosses had never noticed. While you were building your empire, Isabella continued quietly, my father was helping the people who lived under it. She turned the pages slowly. He paid hospital bills, protected small shops, fed families who had nothing. The men at the table looked uncomfortable, because none of them had known. He never asked for credit, Isabella said. He just believed power should protect people. Her voice grew slightly firmer. And you called that man a traitor. The room remained silent. Isabella closed the notebook. For 20 years, his name was buried under your lie. Then she looked directly at Baron. But tonight, her eyes hardened. The truth finally returned to this room. The cemetery was quiet that evening. A gentle wind moved through the trees as Isabella walked slowly along the narrow path. In her hands, she carried a small bundle of white flowers. For many years, Mateo Rivera's grave had been simple, just a small stone, no title, no honor, only a name that most people were afraid to mention. But tonight something was different. A new headstone stood there. Mateo Rivera. Loyal until his last breath. Isabella stopped in front of it. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she noticed something that surprised her. Flowers were already placed around the grave. Many flowers. She turned when she heard quiet footsteps behind her. An older man stepped forward. You may not remember me, he said gently. Your father paid for my daughter's surgery when I had nothing. A woman beside him spoke next. He protected my shop when collectors tried to burn it. Another man nodded slowly. Your father helped my family more than once. More people gathered quietly, each carrying flowers. Stories Isabella had never heard before filled the air. Kindness her father had given without asking for praise. One by one, they placed their flowers beside the grave. Isabella knelt down and laid her own flowers gently on the stone. Her fingers touched her father's name. They know the truth now, Papa, she whispered. Behind her stood people who still remembered Mateo Rivera. And beyond the cemetery waited the city she now controlled. A city ruled by the woman they feared and respected most. The new Mafia queen. Isabella lowered her head slightly. I will protect them, the way you always did. Some stories are not only about power. They are about truth, loyalty, and the choices people make when life becomes difficult. Mateo Rivera lost his life because powerful men believed lies were stronger than honor. They thought fear could silence the truth forever. For many years, it almost did. But this story reminds us of something important. Truth may take time, but it rarely disappears. People may ignore it, they may hide it, they may even try to bury it. Yet one day, it finds its way back. Another lesson is about loyalty and character. Mateo Rivera helped people quietly when he had the chance. He did not do it for fame or reward. And in the end, those small acts of kindness became the reason his name was remembered with respect. So here is something worth thinking about. Power, money, and success may come and go, but the way we treat others often becomes the legacy we leave behind. The real question is simple. When your name is spoken years from now, what will people remember about you? Before you go, think about this for a moment. If you were in Isabella's place, after losing your father, your home, and even your mother because of the same injustice, what would you have chosen? Would you spend 20 years planning revenge? Or would you try to bring justice and restore the truth the way she did? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful part of a story is the conversation it starts.